Okay, so for my foundation I'm using this Cadian Flesh Tone from Citadel. You can see it goes on super smooth and it really enhances my complexion. For the shadows I'm going daring with this Royal Purple from Vallejo. Scratchy. And finally, a highlight with this ravishing Sunny Skin tone. And now we have the basics of our contouring down. We have to blend, blend, blend. I'm covered in paint. Blending is used in all forms of art, and you'll see it used in makeup tutorials, traditional canvas painting and digital design. Generally what we're talking about is creating transitions between two or more different colours that are smooth enough to appear as natural gradients. This isn't the only way to paint minis, of course. You can get some interesting effects by purposely not blending your paints, but the majority of the time nailing those blends can massively improve the look of your model. Let's get into it, but before we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Bleeding Tree Gaming. Layering isn't usually considered blending, but it's foundational to many of the other techniques that we'll be talking about today. It's often enough to give you smooth colour transitions without any extra techniques. Layering involves using thin layers of paint to build up a transition. While layering works well in a lot of circumstances, it's best used for transitions from dark to light colours. You want those layers to blend together particularly smoothly on things like cloth and skin. Pick a range of shades from dark to light. I'd recommend a minimum of 5, but probably closer to 7 or 8. So start with a base, a mid-tone and a highlight, and also some 50-50 mixes to bridge the gap between those. Highlight up from dark to light, keeping your paint as smooth as possible and paying attention to where light and shadow naturally falls. A common mistake is either over or under highlighting. If your mini skin ever looks like this, pale with very dark lines, you probably need to reintroduce some of that mid-tone. Brighter tones will need more intermediate layers than the darker tones will, so make those tonal jumps smaller the further you highlight. To keep your paint flowing nice and smooth for the best transitions, you want to wick off that excess paint on your brush with damp kitchen roll rather than dry. This will control the amount of paint on your brush, which is vital to avoid flooding the mini with paint, while also retaining the moisture, which helps it flow and stay slightly transparent. I use the damp patches where I previously cleaned off my brushes for this. One of the most basic methods of blending out a paint is just by pushing and pulling the pigment around on the model with a brush. We call this feathering. Feathering can be used in all sorts of circumstances where you want one colour to fade to transparency over another already painted area. The brush techniques required are also useful in other skills like wet blending and glazing. Apply some paint to your model fairly thickly. You need a good pigment density to pull off this technique, as you'll be diluting it by stretching it out thin. Clean your brush and wick off excess water on some paper towel. Then use the moist but not wet brush to sweep that colour out, using smooth back and forth motions with the edge of the brush. I sweep the paint out to create a gradual blend. common problems with this technique are that not all colours will blend well with other colours. If you're struggling, maybe try introducing an intermediate colour. Here you can see I've taken some white over black, and that is a very extreme example. Not all paints lend themselves to this technique, depending on the medium used, the pigment density, or even if the paint uses multiple pigments to achieve its hue. You need to experiment to really understand how different paints move and react. The brush you use can have a big impact on the smoothness of your blend. A large brush like this Raphael 8404 size 1 with a nice fat belly, if you use the side rather than the tip of the brush, you've got a large surface area which will help to smooth out the pigments as you're blending. The two brush technique is something you might hear painters talk about, but it's not really a technique as such, more just keeping a second clean brush to hand for your blending. You can either store it in your hand or your mouth. You put the pigment on the model as normal and immediately switch to the other brush. The idea behind this is to just save yourself some time before the paint dries on the model. This technique could be useful for people who live in hot, arid climes where the paint dries on the brush quickly, but living in Britain, it's never something I've had a problem with. Wet blending is similar to feathering, but instead of spreading out one paint, we're painting on two different colours and using our brush and the natural flow of the paints to create a transition between the two. Probably the first thing people think of when they talk about blending, but it's really a situational technique. It's great for your base layers, beginning an interesting transition early, but in the later stages of painting you may want to consider using other methods of blending like layering or glazes. Like when feathering, we want to apply paint fairly thick on the model, except that this time we want to paint two loads of paint on. Once they're both on, clean your brush quickly and sweep the two halves together with that same back and forth horizontal motion we use for feathering. All of the same difficulties as with feathering can be encountered with this technique, as well as the extra problems of controlling a whole additional paint. This could be a place where you find the two brush technique could be handy to ensure that both paints don't dry. Do small patches at once and focus on the transition you're achieving rather than the whole model. Now, oil paints are extremely good for wet blending because they stay wet for a long time. I'm fairly inexperienced at using oil paints this way, so I'll leave that for a future video. If anyone's interested, let me know in the comments. Before we continue, let me pass you over to Autumn Witch to talk about Bleeding Tree Gaming.
Howdy folks, this is Autumn Witch, just popping in to say thank you for coming to Bleeding Tree Gaming. We are a group of hobbyists based in Nottingham, and we produce miniature painting and terrain tutorials, hobby news and gossip, along with hacks and tips from our combined decades in the hobby. If you like our content, please consider liking and sharing this video, and hitting the subscribe button. It would really help appease the almighty algorithm. Now, back to the video.
Loaded brush is a specific blending technique where you load one paint in the belly of your brush and another on the tip. The idea is that the colour on the tip will start out pure, but as you go, more of the colour in the belly will kind of seep through and slowly alter that colour. This technique is pretty situational again, but you might find it useful for doing edge highlights that blend seamlessly into the paint beneath without having to paint multiple layers. To do loaded brush correctly, the paint in the belly has to be way thinner than the paint on the tip. Here I have my thinned down Pro Acryl white in the belly of the brush and a dot of Chimera magenta on the tip. I carefully shape my brush on some paper towel without disturbing the paint too much. As I start to paint the highlights, you can see that they gradually get lighter the longer I paint. You can refresh your brush by dabbing it on some damp paper towel if it starts to dry up. This will not only get the paint flowing, but it will pull more of that paint from the belly of the brush, in this case lightening the highlight. Now, I don't really ever use this technique, but playing around with it for this video has got me kind of enthused about it, so I might play around with it some more in future. You can definitely achieve the same effect with other methods though, particularly if you're fairly new to mini painting, you might find this a bit intimidating. Glazing involves using transparent, thin layers of paint to subtly build up blends and incorporate colours. The term's often used to describe colour filters such as contrast or slapchop, more on that soon. But more properly, glazing is about controlling the amount of paint on your brush. Glazing is great from the middle to the end of the painting process for making fine adjustments or for smoothing out transitions you built up using other blending methods. Here we have a power sword. You can see I've set out bases, midtones and highlights, but transitions are still very clearly visible. To smooth them out, I take one of the colours, in this case Vallejo turquoise, thin down to the point where it's almost coloured water. I then wick off most of the paint on some dry paper towel and carefully lay thin layers over the transition to blur the line and create a blend. Notice I pull the colour towards that turquoise base, giving a smooth blend. I can then repeat that with the other colours to smooth out all of the steps. Going back to our fleshy abomination, I want to add a bit more warmth into that flesh, so I'm going to glaze some scale colour fuchsia over it, pulling it down into the shadows. You can build up some really vivid transitions if you have the patience to keep applying tiny layers like this. If you're getting watermarks from glazing, you're probably putting too much paint on the model. Remember to wick off your brush first and let it dry between glazes. Glazing with an airbrush takes some practice, particularly later in the painting process, but if you use a low pressure and keep to small controlled bursts, you can get some of those blends to look super smooth. The painting technique with a million names: zenithal highlighting, underpainting, contrast, slapchop, grisé. This technique has been around for donkey's years, but every so often it gets given a fancy new name to describe the technique of painting a black and white shadow map and then adding the colour in a transparent coat afterwards. The idea is to get instant shadows and highlights that would take a lot of work to get with traditional blending. This technique is not only great for speed painting, but it's a solid foundation to base more complex paint jobs on. With your model base coated in a dark colour, you'll want to apply bright highlights to it. How you do this is up to you, the main methods being airbrush, rattle can or dry brushing. You can combine these methods or add intermediate greys for more fine tuning. Then it's time to add your colour filter. Contrast paints, army paint or speed paints, or just thin down regular paints will do the trick for this. The trick is to soak the area with liquid paint. Unlike a glaze where you want to really tightly control the amount of paint coming off your brush. While you do want to soak the model, you still don't want to drown it, as then things will start to seep together in ways you can't control. Remember that the colours will show most vividly over the brighter areas in your shadow map, so if your model's looking a little dull, try highlighting a little more in the initial step. Take your Slapchop blends further by wet blending them on the model. You need to work quickly, but you can make use of a small amount of contrast medium or other thinner to apply a quick blend, or just leave the two liquids to naturally meld together. Panel modulation is how you create those lovely blends you often see, especially on Space Marine vehicles. It's best done as an airbrush technique, although if you're really dedicated, you could possibly do it with layering, glazes or underpainting. Be prepared to spend a lot longer though. I've based this Predator in some Sons of Horus green. I'm going to use some thinned down Payne's Grey acrylic ink to just spray in some shading. To work out where the shadows are going to be, I'm going to start with the assumption that the tank is getting hit with the most light on the roof towards the front of the vehicle. To emphasise this, I'm going to start spraying shadows onto the opposite end. Notice how I use the same back and forth horizontal motion as I do with a regular brush. This is the best way to get those gradual blends. Keep your airbrushing fairly light. The last thing you want to do is overspray, as it will mess up a smooth transition like this in seconds. I like to keep my compressor down to about 2 or 3 bars for this, and move fast enough that the shade dries quickly. After a few coats, you'll really start to see that transition build up. When it comes to working out the other panels on the tank, try to contrast dark against light where you can. So you see I have light at the front of the roof, so the front panel will be dark at the top and light at the bottom. Obviously you can't always do this perfectly, but just try and get those strong contrasts in wherever you can. To not mess up the other panels, watch carefully where the cone of spray from your airbrush is going, and make use of the angles of the vehicle to shield areas you don't want to paint at that moment. Of course, you can add to this effect by coming back in with a highlight colour and hitting the opposite end for the panels. Well, that's my look at blending. I've tried to be as comprehensive and informative as possible with this video, so if there's anything you think I've missed or you'd like a more in-depth look at, please let me know in the comments. Videos like this take a lot more work than my standard ones, so I'd super appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe to Bleeding Tree Gaming. See you in the next one.